You dare enter this house carrying his child in your belly after he sent you away?
The orchestra fades. All eyes turn. She's back. The whispers ripple like poison through champagne flutes. Theodora Ashford. They said she'd rot in Pentonville for the theft, for the betrayal. But here she stands, breathing the same air as us. Cut. 2. Across the ballroom, him, the Duke, Lucius Northcroft. Powerful, regal, frozen. His face drains of colour, because he sees it now. The Duchess Regent, his own mother, rises from her throne-like chair, pointing one gloved finger directly at Theodora. You dare enter this house, carrying his child in your belly, after he sent you away. The room shatters into gasps. Did she know she was pregnant when they locked her away? Does he remember sending her to prison? And most importantly, will he claim the child, or deny her existence entirely? The answer will destroy him, but first, you have to see what happens next. Subscribe now, so you don't miss the moment when the Duke falls to his knees begging for her forgiveness, and she refuses to give it. Hit that notification bell. This story will Duke face. The morning light filtered through the modest townhouse windows on Belgrave Street, catching dust motes that danced like tiny confessions. Theodora stood at the mirror in her small dressing room, fingers trailing the edge of her worn silk chemise. 3 years of marriage to Lucius Northcroft had taught her one undeniable truth. Invisibility was survival. She pinned her dark hair into the arrangement that was expected of a duchess. Not too ornate, not too plain, just enough to blend into the wallpaper of aristocratic life. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, muscle memory guiding her through the ritual of becoming acceptable. The woman staring back at her in the reflection was composed, almost serene. No one ever looked closely enough to see the tremor in her jaw. The townhouse was quiet, except for the servants moving through the lower floors. Lucius had not come home last night. She had stopped counting the nights 3 months ago, because counting only made the silence louder. Instead, she had spent the evening organizing the household accounts in the study, a task her husband would never know she performed. The numbers told stories that her voice was never permitted to speak aloud. Stories of diminishing allowances, of creditors growing impatient, of a duke who spent money like he was trying to outrun shame itself. She descended the stairs with her head held at precisely the right angle, the angle that suggested contentment rather than concern. The dining room was arranged for her solitary breakfast: toast, weak tea, a single egg that she would push around the plate while pretending to enjoy it. The servants had learned not to comment on how little she ate. They had learned, as she had, that some questions were dangerous. From her seat, Theodora could hear the butcher's boy arguing with Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, about a debt still unpaid. The words drifted through the partially open door, with the inevitability of judgment. She set down her teacup without a sound, and listened. This was what no one understood about her. She heard everything, because she moved through the world like a ghost, present, but unobserved. The boy wanted payment. Mrs. Hartwell promised it would come when the Duke returned from his business. Business. That was what they called it now. The gambling dens in Mayfair, the opera singers in Covent Garden, the expensive habits that had transformed her husband from a man she barely knew into a stranger she was legally bound to. She had learned his patterns the way a naturalist studies an animal, from a distance, with clinical precision, without allowing emotion to cloud her observations. Theodora finished her tea and rose, smoothing her dress. The blue morning gown was 2 seasons old, but beautifully maintained. She had become expert at maintaining things: appearances, household order, the fiction that a marriage existed at all. The drawing room required her attention. She had planned to go through the guest list for the Duchess Regent's upcoming ball, a task that had fallen to her by default, not by any explicit instruction. Lucius's mother rarely spoke to her directly. She simply expected things to happen, and somehow, through a combination of careful observation and ruthless efficiency, they did. The day stretched before her in its familiar pattern. Calls to make and not receive. Needlework that she executed with mathematical precision. A walk through the park at the correct hour, where she would nod at acquaintances who did not invite her to sit with them. A light supper eaten alone. The careful maintenance of a life that was increasingly suffocating beneath its own propriety. But something felt different this morning. She felt it the way prey animals must feel the presence of a hunter. The air in the townhouse seemed charged with anticipation, though nothing had changed. Everything looked exactly as it always did. Polished, controlled, cold. She was standing at the window of the drawing room, watching a carriage pass on the street below, when the messenger arrived. His knock was urgent, not the usual measured tap of afternoon social calls. Theodora did not turn from the window. She had learned that nothing good came from showing eagerness, from betraying that she had been listening for something, without knowing what. Mrs. Hartwell appeared in the doorway, her face carefully neutral, in that way that meant she had been given instruction to deliver something unexpected. The Duchess Regent was requesting Theodora's presence at Northcroft House, today, before the evening. The words landed like stones thrown into still water, sending out ripples that she immediately worked to suppress. No explanation was given, no invitation extended. Simply a summons dressed in the language of request. Theodora's mind moved swiftly through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Had someone discovered the accounts she had been secretly managing? Had Lucius confessed to some transgression that now required her presence for damage control? Or worse, had the financial situation finally become so precarious that even the Duchess Regent could no longer ignore it? She looked at Mrs. Hartwell, whose eyes held the particular knowledge that servants possessed, the understanding that something was about to shatter. "Have my carriage brought around," Theodora said, her voice steady, even as her heart had begun to move faster. "I will need the green travelling dress, the one from London House." It was her armour, that dress, her best attempt at dignity, her last weapon against a world that had never wanted her to have any power at all. As she moved upstairs to change, Theodora did not allow herself to think beyond the immediate moment. She had survived 3 years of a hollow marriage, by compartmentalizing her fears, by observing rather than reacting, by understanding that anticipation was a luxury she could not afford. Something was coming, something that would require her to be not just invisible but invincible. She did not know yet that her entire life was about to be torn open in a room full of witnesses who would judge every inch of her suffering. The drawing room at Northcroft House felt like the interior of a tomb. Theodora had been there countless times before, but never alone with the 3 people now arrayed before her, like judges at a tribunal. The Duchess Regent sat rigid in her high-backed chair, her silver hair catching the afternoon light like a crown of ice. Beside her stood Lucius's younger brother, Edmund, whose expression carried the particular cruelty of a man who enjoyed watching others suffer. And there, standing by the fireplace with his back to the room, was Lucius himself. He did not turn when she entered. Theodora remained standing near the door, her hands folded before her, the green dress suddenly feeling like armor that would not protect her. The silence stretched into something almost visible, a weight that pressed against her chest. The Duchess Regent's voice cut through first, sharp as broken glass. "Your husband has accumulated debts that would make a tradesman weep," she said, not bothering with preamble or courtesy. £40,000. Gaming halls, women, horses, properties purchased in states of intoxication that he can neither afford nor remember acquiring. Theodora's breath caught, though she did not let her face betray it. £40,000 was a fortune that existed in some other realm of possibility. It was not real money. It was catastrophe wearing the costume of a number. She looked at Lucius, waiting for him to deny it, or explain it, or offer some explanation that would transform this nightmare into mere misunderstanding. He remained motionless, his shoulders rigid, his silence more damning than any confession. The family cannot absorb this loss, the Duchess continued, her fingers drumming once against the armrest with deliberate violence. Our name is already fragile. There are whispers about his competence as a peer. Whispers that he has no business holding the title he inherited. Edmund made a small sound, almost a laugh, quickly suppressed. Theodora felt the ground beneath her, shifting in ways she could not quite name. This was not about explaining herself or proving her value to a husband who had never wanted her. This was about something far more dangerous. My husband's affairs are his own, Theodora said carefully, each word placed like a stone across treacherous water. I am not responsible for his choices. The Duchess Regent's eyes turned to her, with an expression of such absolute certainty that Theodora realized she had already decided something. Whatever this was, it had been predetermined. Her response was irrelevant. No, the Duchess agreed. You are not responsible for his choices, but you are responsible for your own, and you are about to make one now. Lucius finally turned from the fireplace. His face was a mask of carefully constructed neutrality, but beneath it, Theodora could read the faint lines of desperation. He looked at her with an intensity that suggested volumes of unsaid things, none of them good. There is a merchant, the Duchess said, a man of considerable means, but questionable pedigree. His name is Lord Ashford. He has seen you at social events. He finds you suitable. The word landed like a blow. Theodora's mind moved immediately to the logical conclusion, and she felt her jaw tighten. No, she said, the word emerging before she could properly consider it. I cannot agree to anything of that nature. You misunderstand, Edmund interjected, his voice carrying the tone of someone explaining something to a child. This is not a proposal that requires your agreement. The Duchess rose from her chair with glacial slowness, every movement designed to emphasize her authority. She walked toward Theodora, stopping close enough that the younger woman could smell the lavender water and something underneath it, something like threat. Lord Ashford has offered to settle your husband's debts entirely, £40,000, cleared in a single transaction. In exchange, he wants you as his wife, not as a mistress, not as some temporary arrangement, as his legal wife. Theodora's voice came out strangled. I am already married. Not for long, Lucius finally spoke, his voice hollow, almost unrecognizable. I have arranged the papers. It will be quiet, discreet, an annulment based on grounds that no one will question. The words hung in the air like poison. Theodora turned to look at him fully, searching his face for some sign that he was testing her, that this was some elaborate punishment that would resolve into something else. But his expression held only a kind of exhausted resignation. He had already made this choice. He was simply informing her of it. You cannot do this, she said, and even she could hear the desperation creeping into her voice. An annulment without my consent is not legal. My reputation would be destroyed. No one would ever receive me again. No one receives you now, the Duchess said coldly. You are a duchess in name only, a woman married to a fool, living in a townhouse bought with borrowed money that you can no longer pay back. Within 6 months, you will have nothing, no home, no income, no status. You will become precisely what you appear to be, a woman of no significance. Theodora felt the truth of it like a knife between her ribs. She had always known she was tolerated rather than welcomed, accepted rather than valued. But this was different. This was the acknowledgement that she had never truly existed in their world at all. She was merely an object to be moved, traded, disposed of. Lord Ashford, the Duchess continued, is prepared to offer you a settlement, a house of your own in Berkshire, an income sufficient for a woman of your station, protection and respectability, should you choose to remarry after he tires of you. He is not a young man, and he has no children. It is likely, in fact, that he will not live long enough to see the decade out. You would inherit. The logic of it was obscene. They were offering her freedom, but only after stripping her of everything she had believed she owned. Her marriage, her identity, her choice in the matter. I will not do this, Theodora said, though her voice wavered. I will not simply allow myself to be given away like property. Lucius turned away, unable to meet her eyes. Edmund leaned forward, with an expression of genuine curiosity, as though watching an experiment play out. My sister-in-law, do you truly believe you have a choice? What will you do? Refuse? Run? Return to your father, who disowned you when you married my brother? Go to your mother, who died believing you had made the match that would save the family fortune? Every word struck with surgical precision, because Edmund had clearly researched her vulnerabilities. She had nowhere, no one, no power except the fragile respectability that this marriage had granted her, and even that was being used against her. Lord Ashford has agreed to all terms, the Duchess said, moving toward the window, as though the conversation were already concluded. The arrangement will be announced at my ball tomorrow evening. You will make an appearance as the dutiful wife, and by the following week, the annulment will be finalized. Your new husband has already arranged housing. You will leave London the day after the separation becomes public. Theodora stood absolutely still, her mind fragmenting into 1,000 different directions at once. Tomorrow evening, at the ball, in front of everyone, she would be publicly dismissed, publicly rejected, publicly reassigned to a man whose name she barely knew. What if I refuse? The question emerged as barely a whisper. The Duchess turned back to her, and in her eyes was the pure certainty of someone who had never encountered a situation they could not control. Then your husband will announce that he is divorcing you for infidelity. He will declare that you have been unfaithful, that he has lost all faith in you. He will spread the story through every drawing room in London. Your name will become synonymous with shame. Every door will close to you. No one will employ you. No one will shelter you. You will have absolutely nothing. The room seemed to tilt. Theodora realized with perfect clarity that she had been trapped the moment she had entered this house. There had never been any genuine choice at all. There was only the choice between two forms of destruction, and she was being given approximately 15 seconds to decide which one she preferred. Lucius moved toward the door, unable to remain in the same room any longer. As he passed her, he dropped something onto a table near where she stood. An envelope. She did not pick it up. I will need your answer, the Duchess said, before the ball tomorrow. Theodora opened her mouth to speak, to argue, to explain that this could not be happening to her. But the words died before they reached her lips, because she understood, with the terrifying clarity of someone who had just watched her entire existence dissolve, that the Duchess Regent did not care what she said anymore. She had already decided. The world had already decided. All that remained was for Theodora to accept it. Theodora did not return to the townhouse on Belgrave Street. Instead, she allowed herself to be taken to a private residence on Mount Street, a property that Lord Ashford maintained for situations exactly like this one. The carriage journey passed in a blur of gaslight and her own fractured thoughts. She held the envelope from Lucius, unopened in her lap, unable to decide whether its contents would matter or whether she should simply let it burn. The house was immaculate, in a way that suggested money without taste, comfort without warmth. Everything was expensive and new, and arranged with the precision of someone who had consulted with an interior decorator, and then never questioned a single choice. The drawing room held too many mirrors, as though Lord Ashford enjoyed seeing himself reflected from multiple angles simultaneously. He stood waiting for her when she entered, and Theodora's first thought was that the Duchess had not lied about his age. He was perhaps 60, possibly older, with the kind of substantial frame that suggested a life of consistent indulgence. His hair had thinned to a careful arrangement of strands that he had styled to suggest more fullness than actually existed. When he smiled at her, his teeth were too perfect, too white, clearly not the teeth he had been born with. "Mrs. Northcroft," he said, extending his hand. "Though soon, if all goes as planned, you will be Mrs. Ashford. I confess, I am pleased the Duchess was able to arrange this introduction before the ball. It will make tomorrow's announcement considerably less shocking if we have already been acquainted." Theodora took his hand briefly, noting the softness of his palms, the collection of rings that spoke to a man obsessed with displaying his wealth. His touch lingered fractionally longer than social convention required. "Lord Ashford," she said, withdrawing her hand, "I confess myself uncertain what you expect from this arrangement." He gestured to a settee, and she sat, her back perfectly straight, her hands folded in her lap. The posture of obedience, even as she felt something fierce and uncontrolled beginning to move beneath her skin. "I expect very little," he said, settling into a chair across from her with a satisfied expression. "That is precisely why I find this arrangement so appealing. The Duchess has explained your situation to me with admirable clarity. You require protection and security. I require a wife of acceptable social standing. It is a transaction, nothing more, and there is a certain elegance in transactions that are clearly understood from the beginning." He withdrew a document from a side table, where it had apparently been waiting for this precise moment. "I have had my solicitors prepare an agreement. The terms are quite generous, I think. You will have the use of this house during the London season, and a country property in Berkshire during the quieter months. An allowance of £300 per annum, which should be sufficient for your personal needs. Clothing, jewellery, the minor indulgences that women of your station require." Theodora took the document, though she did not open it. "And in exchange, you will be seen at social events with me. You will appear content in your marriage. You will maintain the appearance of propriety and discretion. When we are alone, you need not pretend anything at all. We are simply two people who have reached a mutually beneficial agreement." There was something almost kind in the way he said it, and Theodora realized with a start that he genuinely meant what he was saying. He was not seeking to dominate her or control her in the traditional sense. He wanted a wife the way one might want an elegant painting, something to display, something that reflected well upon him, something that required no genuine interaction or vulnerability. "How long?" she asked. He seemed pleased by the practicality of the question. "There is no specified duration. We are legally married, but I am not a young man, and I have made significant provisions in my will. Should I predecease you, which is statistically likely, you will be well provided for. The house in Berkshire will become yours. A substantial income will be settled upon you. You will have independence and security for the remainder of your life." It was, she realized, exactly what the Duchess had promised. A cage made of gold, but a cage nonetheless. Yet it was also an escape from a far more constricting cage, one made of shame and poverty, and the absolute negation of her existence. "I will need to retrieve my belongings from the townhouse," she said. "Already arranged. Lord Ashford replied. "Your things will be delivered here within the hour. I have also taken the liberty of commissioning new gowns for the ball. The announcement of your marriage will be considerably more impressive if you appear fresh and confident." Over the following days, before the ball itself, Theodora began to understand the particular architecture of her new life. Breakfast with Lord Ashford at 9 o'clock each morning, where he read the newspaper and made occasional observations about business matters that held no relevance to her. He seemed to assume she would not understand such things, and she had decided to let him maintain that assumption. It was easier than correcting him. Their conversations were pleasant and entirely superficial. He asked about her childhood with the kind of polite interest one might extend to a stranger in a railway carriage. She answered with the truth, but carefully edited, removing all the parts that mattered. He told her about his business interests, the various enterprises that had made him wealthy, but his explanations were always simplified, as though he were speaking to a child. On the third morning, she made a small observation about an error in one of his calculations regarding his textile operations. She had not intended to speak at all, had let the mistake escape her lips before she could stop herself. He looked at her with genuine surprise. "You understand mathematics? My father was an architect," she said carefully. "Before circumstances changed, he taught me to read structural designs, to calculate proportions and measurements." Lord Ashford set down his newspaper with an expression that shifted subtly toward something like respect. "That is unexpected, and rather impressive, I must say. Most women of your station have been trained specifically not to burden themselves with such knowledge." It was not a compliment, precisely, but it was not dismissal either. Theodora recognized it as curiosity, the first genuine interest he had shown in her as anything other than an ornament. The following morning, she found that he had placed a business ledger on the breakfast table beside her plate. "I thought perhaps you might find this interesting," he said, with an awkwardness that suggested he was not accustomed to deference in any direction. "My assistant has been making mistakes in the quarterly projections. If your eye is as good as I suspect it is, perhaps you might identify where the errors lie." She worked through the ledger while he read, the scratch of her pencil as she made notes, the only sound in the room. When she identified the mistakes, 3 of them, each more significant than the last, he read her corrections with growing attention. "You have a mind for detail," he said finally. "It is not an unpleasant quality in a wife." That evening, when they were preparing for a dinner engagement at a friend's house, Theodora stood before the mirror in her new room, examining the woman who looked back at her. The gown was exquisite, a deep emerald that brought out colors in her eyes that she had never noticed before. Her hair was arranged by Lord Ashford's personal dresser, curled in a way that suggested elegance rather than fashion. When she descended the stairs, Lord Ashford was waiting in the entrance hall, and he studied her with an expression that she could not immediately categorize. Not lust, not possession, something more like assessment. The look of a man who had acquired something and was beginning to realize it might possess more value than he had initially understood. He extended his arm to her. "Shall we?" She took it, and as they walked toward the carriage, Theodora realized something that frightened her more than anything that had happened since the moment the Duchess Regent had spoken her name. The act was becoming too easy. The pretense of contentment was beginning to feel almost natural. The Duchess Regent's ball had accomplished what it intended. The announcement of Theodora's marriage to Lord Ashford rippled through London society like a stone thrown into still water. But the reaction was not what anyone had anticipated. Instead of simple acceptance, there was a peculiar kind of scandal brewing in whispered conversations and carefully worded inquiries. The speed of the annulment from Lucius. the suddenness of the new marriage. Questions about whether Theodora had somehow orchestrated the first marriage as a stepping stone to a wealthier union. Worse, there were implications that perhaps her marriage to Lucius had ended for reasons beyond official explanation. Some whispered of infidelity. Others suggested financial impropriety on her part. 3 weeks into her marriage to Lord Ashford, Theodora attended a tea with his sister-in-law, Lady Margot, whose eyes contained the particular sharpness of a woman who enjoyed ferreting out uncomfortable truths. They sat in a drawing room, decorated in shades of cream and gold, holding teacups like weapons. "You must understand," Lady Margot said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "that many of us were surprised by your transition. One wonders how you managed to move from one marriage directly into another with such remarkable efficiency. Most women require at least a period of mourning or discretion." Theodora set down her cup with deliberate care. "I am grateful for Lord Ashford's protection during a difficult time." "I'm certain you are," Lady Margot replied, her smile carrying no warmth whatsoever. "Though one cannot help but speculate about the nature of that protection. Was it truly your reputation that required saving, or was there something more consequential?" The implication hung between them, obvious and damaging. Theodora felt something sharp twist in her chest. Not panic, but anger. Pure, clarifying anger at being treated like a riddle, to be solved, rather than a person, to be respected. When she returned to Mount Street that evening, Lord Ashford was in his study, reviewing correspondence. He looked up when she entered, noting immediately the tightness in her jaw. "You have had an unpleasant afternoon," he observed. "Your sister-in-law suggested that I had engineered my separation from the Duke to secure a more advantageous marriage," Theodora said, not bothering with preamble. She implied, quite directly, that there was something improper about the speed of the arrangement. To her surprise, Lord Ashford set down his papers with an expression of genuine annoyance. "Margot has always been insufferable. Her own marriage is a disaster of infidelity and poor management, and she resents anyone who appears to have escaped more gracefully than she has." He paused, studying Theodora with an intensity that had become more frequent in recent days. "The question is whether her implications concern you." "They concern me insofar as they damage your reputation," Theodora replied carefully. "I am your wife. Your standing in society reflects upon me, but my standing reflects upon you as well." He rose from his desk and walked toward her, his movement deliberate. For a moment, she wondered if he intended to touch her, but instead he stopped at a distance that suggested respect for her space. "That is precisely why I married you," he said quietly. "Not for decoration, though you are certainly that, but because you are observant, intelligent, capable of understanding social mechanics in a way that most people are not." He paused, and something almost vulnerable crossed his expression. "It has become clear to me, over these past weeks, that I may have underestimated what this arrangement could be." Theodora felt something shift in her carefully maintained equilibrium. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I find myself enjoying your company in a manner I did not anticipate. I mean that breakfast has become the portion of my day I look forward to most eagerly. I mean that I am beginning to resent the necessity of pretense, and I am not entirely certain how to proceed from this realization." She should have felt relief at his honesty. Instead, she felt trapped by it, because accepting his genuine affection would require her to examine her own feelings, and she had spent considerable effort not doing precisely that. "Lord Ashford," she began, searching for words that would not wound him. "You are kind. You have been generous beyond what was required. But this arrangement was built upon mutual understanding that emotion would not complicate matters." "Yes," he agreed, "but I find myself questioning the wisdom of that agreement." Before Theodora could respond, there was a commotion in the hallway outside his study, raised voices, a servant attempting to prevent entry. Then the study door opened without warning, and Lucius stood in the doorway, his appearance dishevelled, his eyes wild with something that looked like panic. "Theodora," he said, ignoring Lord Ashford entirely. "You must come with me. Immediately." Lord Ashford moved toward the intruder with calm authority. "Whatever matter brings you here, the Northcroft name does not grant you entry to my home without invitation." "The child," Lucius said, his voice breaking across the word. "Theodora's child. She is at St. Thomas's Hospital with fever. The servants came looking for you at the townhouse, but you were not there. They have only just now informed me that you had gone to marry Ashford, and I have been searching for you for 3 hours." The world seemed to pause. Theodora's mind fragmented into 1,000 pieces, each one sharp and terrible. A child, her child, at a hospital, with fever. She had never spoken of the pregnancy to anyone. She had hidden it through the worst months of her marriage to Lucius, through his increasing indifference, and her own deepening isolation. She had believed the stress and the poor nutrition had ended it. She had never allowed herself to consider that it might have progressed. When she found her voice, it emerged barely audible. "How is that possible?" "Because you did not tell me," Lucius said, and there was anguish in his voice now, raw and unfiltered. "Because I was so consumed with my own degradation that I did not notice my wife was carrying my child. Because when I signed those annulment papers, I signed away my connection to a human being I never knew existed." Theodora moved toward him without conscious thought, her body acting before her mind could properly comprehend what was happening. "What is her name?" "Eleanor. The servants called her Eleanor. She is at the hospital because the fever will not break, and they fear—" He could not finish the sentence. Lord Ashford stepped forward, his hand gentle on Theodora's shoulder. "Take my carriage," he said, and his voice carried no resentment, only a kind of resigned understanding. "Go to your child." She looked at him, seeing for the first time the depth of what she had cost him in this arrangement. He had married her believing emotion would not be required, and then he had allowed himself to hope for something more. Now he was watching her leave with another man, following the pull of a bond that transcended contracts and agreements. "Thank you," she whispered, and the words were entirely inadequate. As she moved toward the door, Lucius reached for her hand, and she did not pull away. The touch was shocking in its familiarity, in the way it called to something she had locked away months ago, when she had learned she was carrying his child, and he was too absent to notice. In the carriage, as they moved through the nighttime streets toward the hospital, Lucius sat across from her in the darkness, his hands clenched in his lap. "I have lost everything," he said. "My father would not recognize me. My mother barely tolerates my continued existence. I have destroyed your life, and only just now realize the magnitude of my destruction. And I discover that there is a piece of both of us in the world, and I have known her for less than a day." Theodora reached across the space between them, and covered his hand with hers. "We will go to her now. We will fight for her. Everything else can wait." But even as she said the words, she understood that nothing would ever be the same again. The careful architecture of her arranged life had cracked completely open, and now she had to choose between two forms of devotion, one to the man who had married her as a transaction and had somehow learned to love her, and one to the man who had abandoned her and her child, but was now awakening to the cost of his negligence. She was no longer simply Theodora Ashford or Theodora Northcroft. She was Eleanor's mother, and that identity superseded every contract ever written. Eleanor lived. That was the singular fact that mattered for the first 5 days. The fever broke on the morning of the 4th day at the hospital, and she opened her eyes, grey-green like her mother's, and asked for water, in a voice barely above a whisper. Theodora had not left her bedside, except for the absolute necessities, and even then, she had felt phantom pains in her chest, as though some essential part of herself was being torn away with each moment she spent apart from her daughter. Lucius came every afternoon and sat in the corner of the small hospital room, watching Eleanor with an expression of such profound devastation that it was nearly unbearable to witness. He had missed her birth, her first word, her first step, her entire existence, up until the moment fever had nearly taken her. Now he was attempting to compress 1.5 years of fatherhood into stolen hospital visits, while Theodora pretended not to notice the way his hands shook when he reached for his daughter's fingers. It was Lord Ashford who broke the arrangement, though not in the way Theodora had anticipated. He came to the hospital on the 6th day, carrying flowers and a leather portfolio that he placed on the chair beside Eleanor's bed. His face was composed, but Theodora could read the brittleness beneath the composure, the way a man's features harden when he is holding himself together through sheer force of will. "The child is well?" he asked, his voice perfectly cordial, perfectly hollow. "She will recover completely," Theodora replied. She stood, sensing that this conversation was not meant to happen in front of Eleanor's innocent presence. "Thank you for coming." They stepped into the corridor, away from the small room where her daughter lay recovering from the fever that had nearly claimed her. The hospital smelled of carbolic, and something underneath it, something like death, held at bay through persistence and prayer. "I have received a visitor," Lord Ashford said without preamble. "A gentleman representing the Duchess Regent. It appears there is a question regarding the legitimacy of the child. The timing of the birth in relation to your marriage to the Duke, the circumstances of the separation, the speed with which everything transpired. There are suggestions being made in certain circles that perhaps the child belongs to a different father entirely, or that you were unfaithful during your marriage to Northcroft." Theodora felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She had been so focused on Eleanor's survival that she had not considered the machinery of society still grinding away, still processing the irregularities of her situation, still searching for scandal to feed upon. "The Duchess Regent is using Eleanor to manipulate me," she said quietly. "She is threatening to expose my daughter's origins, to destroy my reputation further." "No," Lord Ashford said, and there was something almost sad in his voice. "The Duchess Regent is using Eleanor to destroy your marriage to me." The distinction landed with terrible clarity. Theodora's mind moved swiftly through the implications. If Eleanor's legitimacy was questioned, if Theodora's character was thoroughly destroyed, then the marriage to Lord Ashford could be portrayed as founded upon deception. It would reflect poorly upon him, would suggest he had been manipulated into accepting damaged goods, would make him a figure of ridicule rather than a man of wisdom and generosity. "What do you intend to do?" she asked. Though she already knew, she could see it in the way he held himself, in the careful distance he maintained between them. "I intend to protect my interests," he said flatly. "My solicitors are preparing documents that will separate us legally, an annulment, much like the one you received from Northcroft, only this time based on grounds that will be considerably less damaging to my reputation. The suggestion will be that I discovered incompatibility early in our union, and chose to end matters before they became more complicated. You will claim I deceived you," Theodora said, understanding the mechanism of her own destruction. "You will suggest that I was unfaithful, that I manipulated you into marriage under false pretenses. I will do what is necessary to preserve my name," he replied, and she could hear the regret in his voice, which was somehow worse than if he had simply been cruel. "You have a daughter who requires your protection now. That must take precedence over whatever you may have felt for me, or whatever I may have felt for you." "I did not deceive you intentionally," Theodora said, and her voice cracked across the words. "I did not know about Eleanor. I swear to you, when I married you, I believed that part of my life was finished. I believed I would carry that loss alone, and that I could be the wife you required. I know, he said, and that knowledge was more terrible than any accusation could have been. Which makes this considerably worse. You were honest within the parameters you understood. I accepted an arrangement, knowing full well what it entailed. But the world will not accept honesty or complexity. The world requires simple stories of villainy and virtue, and your story, unfortunately, will not survive scrutiny. He turned and walked back toward the stairs, his movements deliberate, his posture that of a man who had made a decision and would not permit himself to reconsider it. Theodora stood alone in the hospital corridor, feeling the fragile architecture of her survival collapsing completely. When Lucius found her an hour later, she was still standing in that same spot, her mind fractured into 1,000 different directions. Eleanor is asking for you, he said gently. Then, seeing her face, his expression shifted. What has happened? She told him everything. The Duchess Regent's manipulation, Lord Ashford's capitulation, the legal documents being prepared, the annulment that would paint her as a manipulative woman who had seduced a foolish old man into marriage under false pretenses. Lucius listened, with growing agitation, and when she finished, he reached for her hand, with an intensity that suggested he was holding her back from drowning. Come away with me, he said. Eleanor and you. I will take you both away from London, away from the Duchess Regent and her games, away from society and its judgment. We can rebuild something real, something genuine, away from this nightmare. Theodora looked at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, seeing also the desperate hope that she might forgive him for everything he had done and failed to do. She understood what he was offering, redemption for his past failures, a chance to be the father he should have been from the beginning. I cannot do that, she said, and the words emerged like pieces of her own heart being torn away. You abandoned me, Lucius. You signed papers without question. You allowed your mother to dispose of me like I was a problem to be managed. And yes, I understand that you are attempting to correct those failures now, but they cannot be corrected. They can only be acknowledged. Then stay, he said urgently. Marry me again, properly this time. I will acknowledge Eleanor as my legitimate daughter. I will fight my mother. I will fight society itself, if necessary. With what resources? Theodora asked, not unkindly. You are drowning in debt. You have no power in your own household. Your mother controls everything. The title, the wealth, the social position. She will destroy you if you attempt to defy her. I do not care, Lucius replied, and his voice carried the particular passion of a man who had finally reached the end of his ability to care about anything except the one thing that mattered. Theodora turned away from him, unable to bear the weight of his devotion, when she had nothing left to give. She had used up her emotional capacity, surviving her first marriage. She had stretched herself thin, attempting to be the wife Lord Ashford required, and now there was nothing remaining except the hollow space where her heart had been. I need to be with Eleanor, she said. Beyond that, I cannot promise anything. Theodora, Lucius began, and she heard the fracture in his voice, the moment when hope cracks and begins to crumble. She did not turn around. She could not bear to see the expression on his face, could not handle the weight of his disappointment on top of her own devastation. She walked back toward Eleanor's room, leaving him standing alone in the hospital corridor, with his hands falling uselessly to his sides. Inside the room, Eleanor was sleeping, her small face peaceful, her breathing steady and strong. Theodora sat beside the bed and took her daughter's hand, and for the first time since she had learned of Eleanor's existence, she allowed herself to cry. The tears came in great heaving sobs that she muffled against the blanket, understanding that she had sacrificed everything for survival, and had still ended up with nothing. The arrangements for Eleanor's discharge came through the next morning. Lord Ashford had paid the hospital bill and arranged for a small house in Kensington, far enough from the centre of London that the scandal might not reach quite as urgently. It was an act of kindness that cut deeper than any cruelty could have, because it revealed that he understood her desperation, and chose to help her anyway, even as he was ending their marriage. Theodora packed their belongings in silence. She did not send word to Lucius. She did not attempt to contact Lord Ashford. She simply took her daughter and disappeared into the anonymity that London offered to women who were willing to hide. She had survived the destruction of her first marriage by becoming invisible. Now she was learning to survive by disappearing entirely. The small house in Kensington was modest, but it had become sanctuary. Theodora had arranged her life with the precision of someone who had learned that control was the only currency that mattered. Eleanor attended a small school 3 mornings a week. They took tea in the garden when the weather permitted. Theodora had taken on needlework for a dressmaker, quiet work that required skill but not conversation, income that was sufficient but not comfortable. It was a life of careful management, of survival, prioritized over everything else. It was also a life of absolute emptiness, though she did not permit herself to fully acknowledge that truth. On a Tuesday in October, nearly 4 months after she had disappeared from London, there was a knock at the door that was different from any other knock that had come before it. Theodora knew this because she had become attuned to the particular signatures of necessity: the butcher's boy, the post, the occasional visitor from the dressmaker's shop. This knock carried urgency and something else beneath it, something that made her hands still in the middle of the embroidery she had been completing. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she rose slowly and moved to the window, peering through the lace curtain to see who had come to find her in this place she had chosen specifically because it was supposed to be unfindable. Lucius stood on her doorstep, in clothes that were travel-worn and dusty, his hair dishevelled, his face lined in a way that suggested he had not slept properly in weeks. He looked nothing like a duke. He looked like a man who had travelled significant distances in pursuit of something that mattered more than dignity or propriety or the weight of his own title. She almost did not open the door. She had spent considerable effort constructing walls that would keep him out, that would keep everyone out, that would make it possible to endure the loneliness without constantly feeling the fracture it created in her heart. But Eleanor came down the stairs at that moment, asking who had come, and Theodora heard in her daughter's voice the particular hunger that only a child could express, the need for something that she did not have language to describe. She opened the door. Lucius's eyes found Eleanor first, and she watched something shift fundamentally in his expression, watched him truly see his daughter for perhaps the first time since learning of her existence. Eleanor was small for her age, her hair dark like his, her eyes carrying that peculiar intelligence that seemed to run through both sides of her family. "You are Eleanor," he said, and his voice held the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious occasions. Eleanor looked up at Theodora, seeking permission, or guidance, or some indication of how she should proceed. Theodora felt her throat tighten, felt the careful construction of her emotional defenses begin to crumble. "Yes," Eleanor said simply. "Are you my father?" The question hung between them, weighted with all the months of absence and explanation, and the complicated reality of a man who had not known his daughter existed. "I am," Lucius said. Then, looking directly at Theodora, "I am attempting to become worthy of that designation." She stepped aside, allowing him entry into the small house, though allowing him to cross the threshold felt like permitting something dangerous to take root in the sanctuary she had built. Eleanor led him to the small parlour, where she had been reading, and she showed him her book with the particular pride of a child displaying something precious. He sat and listened to her read aloud, his eyes never leaving his daughter's face, and Theodora stood in the doorway and felt something that resembled peace begin to bloom in the carefully guarded spaces of her heart. It was after Eleanor had been put to bed that Lucius turned to Theodora in the parlour, and she saw that he had been gathering courage for this conversation the entire time he had been in the house. "I have ended my engagement with the Duchess Regent," he said, without preamble. "Not merely separated myself from her control, but formally severed our connection. She has disinherited me. The title will pass to Edmund, though I suspect he will find it considerably less lucrative than he anticipates, given the state of the family finances." "Why would you do something so destructive?" Theodora asked, though she already knew the answer. "Because I am finished being controlled by fear," Lucius replied. "Because I spent 30 years allowing my mother to determine the shape of my life, and it transformed me into a man I did not recognize. A man who abandoned a woman carrying his child. A man who was too weak to stand against family pressure. A man who destroyed a marriage through negligence and cowardice." He rose and walked toward her, and she did not step backward, though every instinct screamed at her to maintain distance. "I have attempted to rebuild my finances independently," he continued. "It will take years, and it will require work in ways that no duke is accustomed to undertaking. But I can offer you something now that I could not offer before. Independence, choice, the ability to marry me or refuse me without economic consequences either way." Theodora felt something sharp pierce through the walls she had constructed so carefully. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I love you," Lucius said, and the words were raw and unfiltered, carrying none of the polished language of courtship or the careful phrasing of a man attempting to manipulate someone into compliance. "I have loved you since the moment I saw you standing in my mother's drawing room, attempting to maintain composure while your entire world was being torn apart. I loved you through the months of our marriage, when I was too consumed with my own failures to notice you were slowly disappearing. And I love you now, standing in this small house, having sacrificed everything to protect our daughter from the machinery of society that would have destroyed her." Theodora wanted to retreat into logic, to remind him of the reasons why this was impossible, why she could not afford to trust in declarations of love from a man whose history suggested he would crumble under pressure. She wanted to protect herself from the particular vulnerability of believing someone when belief had cost her so much already. "You will change your mind," she said, her voice barely audible, "when the reality of poverty becomes clear. When the weight of social disgrace settles upon you completely. When you discover that I am not the woman you imagine, but simply a woman attempting to survive." "I have already lived with wealth and social position," Lucius replied. "It did not make me happy. It did not make me virtuous. It did not make me the kind of man who could be trusted with the heart of someone I claimed to love. Perhaps poverty will break me entirely. Perhaps I will discover that I am incapable of becoming the man you deserve to be married to. But I would rather discover that truth in an honest attempt than spend the remainder of my life wondering what might have happened if I had been brave enough to try." He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, the contact shocking in its simplicity and its intensity. She could feel his pulse through his palm, could feel the tremor that suggested he was terrified she would reject him entirely. "I do not know how to trust love anymore," she whispered. "Then we will build it slowly," he said, "day by day, conversation by conversation, without pressure or performance or pretense. Simply two people attempting to understand each other and to choose each other, repeatedly, in the face of all the reasons why it would be easier to remain separate." She thought of Lord Ashford who had married her as a transaction and had learned to love her genuinely. She thought of the architecture of that failed marriage, built on necessity rather than choice. She thought of how she had learned to be a wife without ever learning to be loved. "I am afraid," she said, and the admission felt like standing at the edge of a precipice. "I know," Lucius replied, "but Eleanor needs more than survival. She needs a father who is present. You need more than simply endurance. You need a partner who will stand beside you, even when standing beside you costs him everything." Theodora looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not the Duke she had never wanted, but the man beneath the title. A man who had been broken by his own weakness and was attempting to rebuild something real from the ruins of his failure. "If I agree to marry you again," she said slowly, "it will be a scandal. The annulment to me, then to Lord Ashford, and now a return to you. Society will have a field day constructing the narrative." "Let them," Lucius said. "Let them tell whatever story pleases them. The only story that matters is the one we tell ourselves, in the quiet moments before sleep, in the morning when we wake and choose each other again." She said yes without intending to, the words simply escaping from the place where her heart had been locked away. He pulled her into an embrace, and she felt herself dissolve into him, felt the careful architecture of her self-protection crumble completely. The marriage happened 6 weeks later in a small church in Hampshire, with Eleanor as a witness and Lord Ashford in attendance, sitting quietly in the back pew, with an expression of such gentle sadness that it nearly broke Theodora's heart. He had come to wish them well, to give his blessing to the union that would have been impossible without his own act of mercy. After the ceremony, he took Theodora's hand and held it for a moment in silence. "Be happy," he said simply. "That was all I ever wanted for you." The house they rented together was small, but genuine. There was a garden where Eleanor could play. There was a study where Lucius had begun to rebuild his finances through legitimate work. There was a bedroom where Theodora could lie beside her husband and feel, for the first time in her adult life, that she was not simply surviving, but actually living. One morning, Theodora woke before dawn and found Lucius already awake, watching Eleanor through the doorway of their bedroom. She was sleeping soundly in the small room across the hall, her hand curled around a wooden horse that her father had carved for her. "I cannot believe I almost lost her," Lucius whispered, and there was still wonder and gratitude in his voice, even after weeks of their new life together. Theodora took his hand and held it against her heart, feeling the steady rhythm of her own pulse beneath his palm. The journey from that moment in the Duchess Regent's drawing room to this quiet morning had been almost unbearable. She had been treated as property, dismissed as insignificant, forced into arrangements that denied her agency and choice. But in the end, it was not the arrangement that had saved her. It was the people who had chosen to see her, who had chosen to love her despite the cost. Lord Ashford, who had learned that genuine feeling could grow from the most transactional of beginnings. And Lucius, who had finally learned that redemption was possible only through consistent choice, through the daily decision to show up and be present, and become worthy of the love that was offered to him. She turned to look at her husband in the early morning light, seeing not the failed Duke, but the man he was becoming. And she understood that survival and love were not opposites at all. They were simply different points along the same continuum of learning to be human, of learning to matter, of learning that even in a world that had tried very hard to render you invisible, you could choose to be seen.